So it's striking to me that without any real coordination among us ahead of time, there's some real themes running through the presentations. And the running theme is all about transition, right? The end of something old, the beginning of something new, the horror of the chaos of the moment as the one thing is struggling to die and the other thing is struggling to be born. You'll all be happy to know the data supports that. So I'm going to give you some vital signs. Maybe we'll think about it that way, right? I'm going to read from the chart and give you some stats on where the old world is and where the new world is coming to be. And I'm going to actually start with an obituary. And it is an obituary for white Christian America. It comes from the beginning of my book that came out last summer. It literally begins with an obituary for white Christian America. I'm going to read an excerpt from it because I think it's a good place to start. We've had a birth narrative. We're going to have an obituary. All right, here we go. After a long life spanning nearly 240 years, white Christian America, a prominent cultural force in the nation's history, has died. White Christian America first began to exhibit troubling symptoms in the 1960s when white mainline Protestant denominations began to shrink, but showed signs of rallying with the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s. Following the 2004 presidential election, however, it became clear that white Christian America's powers were failing. Although examiners have not been able to pinpoint the exact time of death, the best evidence suggests that white Christian America finally succumbed in the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of environmental and internal factors, complications stemming from major demographic changes in the country, along with religious disaffiliation, as many of its younger members began to doubt white Christian America's continued relevance, as Serene was pointing out, in a changing cultural environment. Among white Christian America's many notable achievements was its service to the nation as a cultural touchstone during much of its life. It provided a shared aesthetic, a historical framework, and a moral vocabulary. White Christian America's vibrancy was historically one of the most prominent features of American public life. But white Christian America has not been without its critics and controversies. Its reputation was especially marred by its general accommodation to and participation in the institution of slavery up until the Civil War. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, white Christian America's apathy toward, and in many quarters even staunch defense of, segregation in the American South did little to overturn these negative associations. Its credibility was also damaged when it became mired in partisan politics in the closing decades of the 20th century. Late in its life, white Christian America also struggled to adequately address issues such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, which were of particular importance to its younger members as well as to younger Americans overall. White Christian America is survived by two principal branches of descendants: a mainline Protestant family residing primarily in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, and an evangelical Protestant family living mostly in the South. Plans for a public memorial service have not been announced. All right? So let me walk through, just give you some data. I had some slides. You'll be glad to know that technical difficulties have spared you of those slides. But I will give you sort of a visual narrative of them nonetheless. Because it really is the story and less than the numbers that really make sense here. But one of in 2012, right after Barack Obama's reelection, I got what was probably the most troubling email I've ever received from a white Christian group. I'm on all kinds of mailing lists. And this was right after Barack Obama's reelection. It was between that and Thanksgiving. And this email landed in my inbox, and it had this black and white photo on the top of it of a group of people around a table. They're all white. There's a man at the head of the household. It's basically a Thanksgiving table scene that they're setting up there. Maybe you know the Norman Rockwell Freedom from Want painting. It looked a lot like that. It's a black and white photo. And the little caption said, "Christian Family at Prayer, Pennsylvania, 1942." And then if you went down the line and you kind of kept reading the email, what became kind of striking about it is that this was an email from the Christian Coalition. of America, which is a kind of white conservative Protestant group in the country. And when I kept kind of looking at it, I realized, okay, this is really odd. What is this showing, right? This image of this white Christian family at prayer right after our first African-American president has been reelected to office. And it became like suddenly clear, oh, that's America, right? That's a reclaiming of America in the face of the reelection of our first African-American president. And what was striking about it is I kind of kept reading, and looking for the text. It basically said this. We are about to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Thanksgiving, and God has not yet condemned this nation, although we now so richly deserve it. Please join with us in praying for our nation, for God to protect us from those enemies without and within who want to see America destroyed. That was the text right under this photo of the white Christian family at prayer. And it just stayed with me. I couldn't quite shake it. It just seemed so over the top and so apocalyptic. As I begin to kind of take a step back and look at the data, my day job is kind of looking at religious and cultural trends in the country. I began to realize that we had passed this monumental threshold in the country that no one was really talking about. And I think some of the real dysfunction and anxiety and transference and all kinds of odd behavior by white Christians in this country is because they do not understand, or they sort of feel it in their bones, but haven't been able to take it into their mind and their kind of conscious psyche, the end of this world. If we look at the stats, just to give you a few, we actually, during Barack Obama's presidency, crossed from being a majority white Christian nation, demographically speaking, to a minority white Christian nation. So we went from, at the beginning, when Barack Obama was reelected, 54% of the country identified as white, non-Hispanic, and Christian. By the time Barack Obama left office in this last election cycle, that number had dropped from 54% to 43%, right? 11 percentage points during Barack Obama's presidency. The other bellwether issue for conservative white Christians especially was the issue of same-sex marriage. Right, all in, opposing that issue from day one, well before abortion, well before any other issue, was opposition to gay rights. And what we saw in the numbers on that is that when Barack Obama first got into office, only 39% of the country supported same-sex marriage. Barack Obama himself did not publicly support same-sex marriage in 2008. By the time Barack Obama leaves office and we have this last election cycle, that number jumped to 59% support in the country. We have more recent numbers, even from 2017, it's gone from 59 to 63 just in the last few months. But if you think about that, right, and you're like a conservative white Christian, that is the end of the world, right? And I think that is part of what we are dealing with in our country right now, is this reaction. To kind of make this really clear, if we look at the generational differences in the country and religious identification, and you look at seniors, and you think of maybe that black and white photo from 1942, right, and what counted as America, 2/3 of seniors, Americans age 65 or older, identify as white and Christian. That number among young people today is about 20%. So there is this factor of 3 change just over the generations that are alive today. Right? It's an enormous amount of change that we have upon us. Part of that change has been driven by young white Christians leaving their churches in droves. In fact, if you look at the number of unaffiliated people in the country, we have gone from being only 6%, a country that in the 1990s had only 6% of the country claiming no religious affiliation. That number today is 23%. Right? It's increased by a factor of 4. If you look at young people today, it is nearly 40% of young people who claim no religious affiliation. Now, I'm not talking about people who just say they don't go to church or mosque or synagogue. These are people who will not claim a religious label of any kind. When you ask them what is their religion, they say nothing. That is a genuinely new thing in the American scene that we're dealing with. Most of those people were raised in white Christian churches and left. All of that is to say, the one thing that we're seeing here is a sort of, cultural world that is sick unto death. And people are reacting to that. The other thing I wanted to say before I kind of give a shift to the question of race is there's nothing in the data, even though, what's difficult, I think, about this election and to kind of keep perspective on this election is that so much has changed, right? Both houses of Congress, the White House, Supreme Court justice. I mean, it is big, and there are a lot of changes. What is so difficult about it, I think, is that so little changed to create this massive event. If you look at the election, if you gave me 78,000 votes, I could present to you President Hillary Clinton. 3 states, 77,744 votes across 3 states were what determined this election. That is 0.05% of the votes that were cast in the election. In Michigan, it came down to 10,000 votes in Michigan. Very, very, very close election. There are only 2 elections in American history where a president lost the popular vote by a bigger margin and still won the presidency. And both of those were in the 19th century. So it is really a very anomalous event. One of the things I think is happening here, and maybe one metaphor, if I continue the kind of death thing to think about it, is what we're experiencing is a world that has sensed itself dying and has rushed to throw every kind of life support it can throw at itself to keep itself alive. But we all know what happens, right, in the medical settings when that happens, right? That's the reason why we have advanced medical directives and those sorts of things. Because sooner or later, if we're just throwing every piece of technology we have at death, we end up with the extended heartbeat and breath that is no longer a person. It's funny you mentioned horror movies. I actually mentioned Frankenstein in the book. And the reason I used it is, and probably I'm not a theologian. I work with numbers most of the time, but I would say maybe the most theological line in the book is where I'm talking about this sense of white Christian churches like they're on life support, right? But it's an artificial extension of something that has died. And I said there that it's like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? And it is this human attempt at resurrecting something that has died. And the thing that we know is that resurrection by anything other than divine power always produces a monstrosity. And I think that is part of what we're seeing in our politics and in our society today. This topic was like, where are we? Kind of big picture stuff. I'm going to say a little bit about race here. This morning, actually, I was catching up on some news. So I'm a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. It's the largest Southern Baptist seminary in the country. It's the largest seminary, bar none, actually, in the country in terms of numbers of students. Just this week, there was a story that I think is like, in some ways, like a real sense of like, where are we in terms of, particularly the white evangelical world on race. Some of you may have seen it. It was kind of under the radar, so probably not, but I'll describe another photo to you. The entire senior faculty of the School of Preaching at Southwestern Seminary decided it would be a good idea, they're all white and middle-aged, to dress up like African-American rappers. And to take a photo and to put it on Twitter, and wrote Notorious SOP, School of Preaching, and a backdrop behind them in graffiti style writing. And we're posing, making, pseudo gang signs, and one of them has a handgun across his chest in the photo. And under it, it was like, come rap the word and reach the world for Christ. It's since been taken down, and some apologies have been issued. But this is the senior leadership of the largest white Christian seminary in the country that is running the School of Preaching for the next generation of evangelical ministers in the country. that this went under the radar until there was an outcry for. I may not need to say much other than that, but I'm going to say a little bit more. A couple of things that we've asked about that I think go right to the heart of it is two questions, two survey questions. One is a question, it's kind of a broad question that divides the country right in half, and it's this. Do you think that American way of life and culture has changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s? The country is evenly divided on this question. The two political parties are mirror opposites of one another on this question, almost to the single digit. 2/3 of Republicans say things have changed for the worst since the 1950s. 2/3 of Democrats say things have changed for the better since the 1950s. Every group of white Christians, white mainline Protestants, those are supposedly the more progressive group, white evangelical Protestants say things have changed for the worst. But no group says things have changed for the worst more than white evangelical Protestants, 75% of whom say things have changed for the worst since the 1950s. The other question is somewhat similar, and just in terms of perception differences that are quite stark. And that is a question about whether the killing of unarmed men by police is an isolated, or do you see the killing of unarmed men by police as isolated incidents or are part of a broader pattern? Nearly 9 in 10 African Americans say these are absolutely part of a broader pattern. Only about 4 in 10 whites overall say that this is a broader pattern. A majority say these are isolated incidents. But here's the striking thing, since we're sitting in a church. If you take whites and you add religion, they move further from their black brothers and sisters on this question. White unaffiliated Americans look more like African Americans on this question than do white Christians on this question. So let me kind of wrap up with this. I mean, one of the biggest challenges here, I think, is our isolation, our racial and ethnic isolation from one another in the country. We did some survey work where we asked about people's closest friendships and who they had in their circle of closest friendships. So we asked about their race, their gender, their religion, and it turns out if we look at the average white person in America, their closest friendship, we asked them to name up to 7 people who were really close to them. And the average social network, not Twitter, but close friendship network of a white person in the country is 91% white. And 75% of whites have no person of color of any kind in their closest set of friendships. In our churches, this church is a wild anomaly from what we see. 85% of churches in this country are essentially monoracial churches. It has changed a little since the 1970s, but not that much as these measures are going. So I'll wrap up with this. At the end of the book, I compare another image, and it's a Coca-Cola commercial that came out in 2012. Some of you may have seen it. It aired during the Super Bowl. It was called It's Beautiful, right? And it was Coca-Cola, and they had people singing America the Beautiful in many different languages. It was a montage of all kinds of Americans, gay, straight, black, white, brown, you name it, in the thing. And there was a huge divide over how to react. There's a huge backlash on the one hand, said, we speak American here, those kinds of comments, on the one side, and other people embracing it. But I think if I think about that image, and in those images, there's a scene at the end where there are people sitting around a table, and it's a very multicultural, table, and there's a woman at the head of the table in that photo, and I compare it to that other one that I began the talk with, this black and white photo with this man at the head of the table, and I just can't resist this. By the way, we built this stuff into our furniture. Any of you have those antique dining room tables that only has one chair with arms on it, right? What's that about, right? That's the patriarch's chair. So this is what we have in this photo. And this contrasting image, right, of who are we? Who are we as a country? Who are we going to be? Who should we be? And this is the fight, I think, that we're having right now in the country. It's much less about, R or D. I mean, the R's and D's tend to stand in, I think, for this bigger question. In fact, in this election, we probably couldn't have had a more almost caricature of that question, right? With Donald Trump with this explicitly backward-looking "Make America Great Again" and this retro farmer hat on, and Hillary Clinton with this slick, very social media friendly H with the arrow pointing forward in it, right? I mean, there's two very contrasting images. But I think the task before us is to think about those two images, right? And particularly this second one, this multicultural image that says, and ask, is this, I think the questions are, is this the end of the world as we know it? And is it beautiful? Right? And the task, I think, is to help the country, and I hope, help white Christians in this country answer yes to both of those questions. I'll end it there.